Okay, what I wanted to discuss is perhaps initially a rather drier subject, but in fact concerns the most important social, economic, and in some respects international transformation of Cuban economy and society over the last 20 years. And as I'm sure you know, Cuba throughout the 20th century was renowned as being overwhelmingly a sugar producer and exporter. In 1925, it was producing 5 million tons of sugar. That comprised some 30% of the world's total cane sugar production. And in 1989, sugar still accounted for over 70% of all Cuba's export earnings. There were about 156 sugar factories which employed between 400 and 500,000 workers in agriculture and industry, comprising some 25 to 30% of the working population of Cuba. And it was, in 1989, still the world's largest sugar exporter, if not producer. This was explained throughout the 1970s and 80s by Cuba's integration into the so-called International Division of Labor of the Socialist Camp, whereby Cuba, as the most efficient sugar producer within the Soviet bloc and Comecon, concentrated on the production of sugar, which it exchanged for extremely favorable terms with the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe for their imports of manufacturers, raw materials, etc. And in the case of the deal with the USSR, the terms were especially favorable. In fact, pegged at initially high prices, Cuban sugar was exported with index linked to the price of Soviet imports imports to Cuba from the Soviet Union, including the imports, prices of oil. So if Soviet oil prices went up, Cuban sugar prices went up in compensation. And that made the sugar economy extremely lucrative. And it was the surpluses derived from the sugar trade that essentially financed the enormous expenditures on education and public health, which permitted Cuba, albeit a third world country, essentially to establish first world services at quite an early stage of development. In 1989, let's say Cuba export earnings were over 70% derived from sugar, and only 10% from services. But by 2006, the transformation was such that sugar exports comprised only 10% of Cuba's export earnings, while services were earning over 70%. Now, this remarkable transformation in the first place reflected a drastic decline of the sugar economy, and this was primarily associated with the drying up of certain of Cuba's markets, particularly in Eastern Europe, but primarily to the fall in prices from Russia and so-called countries in the CIS, Community of Independent States, which were the ex-USSR. And this sharp fall in revenues from sugar so compressed Cuba's total import earnings that it had to devote the bulk of those earnings to essentials such as oil, foodstuffs, and other key raw materials during this dreadful so-called special period of the 1990s. And in the context of endeavoring to keep functioning a sugar economy which was highly mechanized, with over 70% of sugar cut by machine, with all sugar mechanically loaded, and with it transshipped to the sugar mills via a complicated system of cleaning stations, etc., etc. The import costs of endeavoring to maintain an economy organized in that modernized form proved quite impossible to sustain. And Cuba's sugar production fell from some 7.6 million tons in 1989 to some 4 million tons by 2000, And in between 2000 and 2006 and 2006 to the present day, Cuban annual sugar production has been something 1.2 to 1.4 million tons. And it has actually been importing over the last 3 years sugar from Brazil. And that's in order to maintain certain export commitments. It imports sugar for its own domestic consumption. The compensating growth sector has been services. And most people think of, that must mean tourism. In fact, when Luis Maron, the political counselor, Cuban embassy, who was at our conference in Aaron this year, referred to tourism as the most important foreign exchange earning sector, I was obliged to go back afterwards to him to correct him and to provide him with Cuban statistics which indicated that the gross earnings of tourism in Cuba in 2006-07 was something like 2 billion pesos of a total of some 7 billion pesos, in other words, less than a third. And that referred to the gross earnings, not the net earnings of tourism, because you will be aware from the costs of transport, the import costs and content of the hotels in which you stay, the food and facilities which you enjoy, that in fact how many cents the Cubans get from each US dollar equivalent is about 40 to 30, in between 30 and 40 cents. So the net earnings from tourism are substantially below. Cubans are coy in the data about what comprises the particular components of their services export earnings. But there is no doubt that over 60% of these are derived from the export of professional services, above all in the fields of health, education, and other technical services. And approximately in between 60 and 70,000 Cuban professionals working overseas now earn substantially greater revenues than the 156 sugar factories and 400 to 450,000 workers earned from sugar, even in the peak period of production and prices of 1989. Now this, of course, is related to a very important change in Cuba's international situation, and one particularly important change, and that was the coming to power of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela in 2000. Chavez and his economy, oil-rich, was able to offset to an extremely important extent the sharp international costs which Cuba suffered as a consequence of the disappearance and dissolution of the Soviet bloc, with all the intimate and profitable trade links that had linked Cuba to that bloc up until 1989 and 91. And Venezuela was able to supply oil, a key import, at prices very favorably linked to Cuba's exports, and Cuba's exports to Venezuela were overwhelmingly those of technical folk, particularly in medicine, health, and education. It's important to stress, because this relationship has been an extraordinarily fruitful one, both for Cuba and for Venezuela, the mutually beneficial character of this relationship. When Chavez came to power in 1980, he promised the fulfillment of certain social missions. And the two most important social missions were the provision of free public health to all and of education for all. And this in the context of a country with dramatic inequalities of income, with extensive underprivileged populations in both urban and rural areas, in which medical provision was in the hands of a small elite middle-class group of Venezuelan physicians who did not embark into the countryside to live and work and make available their services, nor did they do so in the shanty towns of Caracas. And if Chavez had had to depend on Venezuela's own medical establishment for the fulfillment of its social missions, it would have failed. And Chavez and all his promises would have gone down as just the rhetoric of another failed Latin American populist. What enabled Chavez to fulfill his social missions was the fact that Cuba was able to place in the deprived communities of Venezuela up to 20,000 and more medical professionals who were both able and willing to provide free medical attention to the underprivileged communities, themselves living and working in difficult physical and economic conditions. At the same time, Cuban pedagogical instructors gave a key push to the training and execution of mass literacy campaigns. And one particular campaign in the field of eye operations and eyesight saving surgery you probably know about is so-called Operación Milagro, Operation Miracle. This was to deal with a well-known scourge of poor countries around and about the world where fairly simple but pervasive eye problems, detached retinas, cataracts, and glaucoma remain untreated, and if they do remain untreated, commonly lead to blindness. These are resolved by fairly simple surgical techniques and by the establishment of many mobile and fixed ophthalmological stations around and about Venezuela and progressively throughout Central America and Bolivia, etc. Cuban ophthalmic surgeons were able to undertake what by 2007-8 amounted to 2 million eye-saving operations throughout the country. An irony, perhaps, you may recall that Che Guevara was executed by a Bolivian Sergeant Mario Terán, who at the age of 82 was reported by his son to be blind and in hiding, as he had been for many, many years in Bolivia. And his sight was saved by the intervention of Cuban eye surgeons. And if you like, it's rather a New Testament style. Some people put it down as the curse of Che, but manifesting itself not in its usual way, i.e. a high rate of mortality among the assorted Bolivian generals and officials associated with the campaign against him and his eventual killing, in this case saving the sight of Mario Terán. What's the significance for Cuba, of course, is that it receives substantial material assistance, which has permitted it to establish a balance of payments equilibrium after decades in which it had always had a substantial balance of payments deficit, which had been financed by Soviet subsidies and generous Soviet credits, which ended in 1991. So the Cuban economy, although it's currently going through difficulties along with a large number of other economies in the world, the Cuban economy by 2006-07 had not only emerged from the special period, but was experiencing substantial periods of economic growth with substantial improvements in living standards, most notably in certain areas which have been difficult areas, such as food consumption in the preceding years. Whereas Venezuela, on the other hand, the Venezuelan regime was able to consolidate and broaden its popular support because it was actually able to fulfill, in the face, it must be noted, of vehement opposition from Venezuela's medical establishment, but fulfill these so-called social missions. I would conclude by simply noting what this has meant in a wider context in Latin America. Until the end of the Soviet bloc, US doctrine, of course, portrayed Cuba in the Western Hemisphere as being a Soviet puppet, a spearhead for communist advance in the Western Hemisphere, a threat to the national security of all Latin American countries and of the United States itself, an exporter of armed revolution. And indeed, for a number of countries, particularly those in the Caribbean, you may know that José Martí had referred to the United States as the Colossus to the north. A number of these smaller islands for the Caribbean regarded the Colossus to the north to be Cuba, because Cuba in the 1970s had demonstrated its ability to project its armed power into South Africa with armoured support artillery and aircraft capable of taking on and defeating the South African Defence Force, which was the most formidable military force in South Africa. By 2006, what was Cuba's condition? It threatened no one overseas. Its military, it didn't have a single soldier serving overseas. Its role in Latin America had been transformed not from a potential exporter of armed revolution, but for the most important single provider of basic health and education care to the poorest people in Latin America, low cost and in alliance with Venezuela, and in association, of course, within Latin America with the rise of the so-called pink tide of progressive Latin American regimes, Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, Brazil, Venezuela, Bolivia, Nicaragua, etc., Ecuador, and now most recently El Salvador, which established diplomatic relations, in a context in which the United States itself has become the isolated power in the Western Hemisphere. Cuba is not the isolated country. It's now the United States that's the isolated country. And this was manifested when, this year, having been expelled in 1962 from the Organization of American States, against US opposition alone, Latin America voted readmission of Cuba into the Organization of American States, and Barack Obama was obliged in Trinidad and Tobago earlier this year to make a rather groveling speech promising that historic imbalances in relations and lack of interest in Latin America would now be corrected, and now there would be a relationship of partnership, an equal partnership, di-da. But what we do know is that the context at the moment in which the United States finds itself with its obsessions and being bogged down in so-called asymmetric warfare in Iraq and Afghanistan has meant that it's been completely unable to devote itself to dealing with a far more potent threat as it perceives it in the terms of the development of progressive regimes to the south of the border. And Cuba's alliance and the nature of its alliance with Venezuela and other Latin American countries, as well as the transformation within Cuba from a country specializing in the commodity of exports based on the use of a lot of manual and semi-skilled and skilled labor to the export of primarily highly skilled professional services represents a very important transformation within Cuba itself. I merely will end by noting one thing, because it reflects a question which is often asked. How is it that Cuba, okay, they produce a whole lot of medical students through unrivaled medical training facilities. How can they can export these medics, but how is it that these medics function and work so well in material conditions in which doctors from other countries would not be prepared to do? And one of the answers to this is that in the 1970s, Cuba established, it used to have three main universities, in Havana, Santa Clara, and Santiago de Cuba. It opened up universities in all 14 of its provinces in the 1970s, with medical faculties established throughout the country. Now those, of course, are free entrance for students. And the students, of course, drawn from trained by each of these faculties, come from the local population. And they come not from, as our medical students come, overwhelmingly middle-class families who live in a middle-class milieu. They come from ordinary Cuban households. And throughout all the difficulties of the special period, these folk, as kids, experienced all the material and other deprivations of the rest of the Cuban populace during the special period, and in their work and training had to deal with all the problems of scarcities of equipment, medical provisions, pharmaceutical products, etc., etc. And they had perforce to develop a high emphasis not only on preventive medicine, but also on improvisation and making what you could, making the best of what you could of what limited and erratic sources might locally be available. Now, these sorts of situations are precisely the kinds of conditions in which they find themselves when they're serving overseas. But it's not entirely alien to them. It's not a great culture shock either. And this is one of the primary reasons why they are able to do what medics from a number of other countries would not be able to do. I'm sometimes asked, well, if the Cubans could do this, couldn't we do this by training up more medics in Scotland? Well, you could if you could train that kind of medical student who, on graduation, would be prepared to go and live in every tower block, one per tower block. Don't ask me where they're going to park the BMWs, but to live within the community, to get to know the social conditions of every household, this, that, and the other. In other words, it's not simply a quantitative generation and production of medical students, it's a production of doctors who also have a particular vocational sense, a particular experience, and an ability to work in difficult conditions. That's my time. Thank you.